and we can start off with that. If there's, I don't have any questions scripted out for you. I just figured, I've known Ted for a while. I think I can come up with
Go with the flow
off my head. Yeah, and if there's anything that I ask that you can't talk about, just say
Sure,
it. No big deal.
sure.
But as we were just talking about, well, you had an opportunity and you blew it?
Yes, big time, big time. Not a total failure, because out of a 1:37 observation, I did get 4 exciting seconds of videotape, 2 of them out of focus, but not bad for a beginner, I guess. And what is really aggravating is I've done a lot of professional photography work over my life, and quite familiar with photographic equipment. But you know, the interesting thing is, as I was telling everyone, or not everyone, but a few friends about the sighting, and I'd say, well, I've joined the world of the crazy folks now, and having actually for the first time seen something, and what I'm getting, it's really surprising. It seems to be sort of a comfort to, I've had a lot of people at this conference come up and say, I really appreciate the way you address this, because you know you're showing the human side of this, and they're somewhat relieved because they have seen something and gone through the very same procedure, you know. And I remember very well the absolute expert ever on the subject, J. Allen Hynek. And he had one good observation from an airliner, and it's the worst photo you ever saw in your life, you know. And he had the Air Force's stereo camera. They released about a dozen of these to the project people, to Allen and then the ranking officers, in case they should ever see something, and which, by the way, was given to me after his death, and is a real treasure. And it's kind of a hokey, low-quality stereo camera. I mean, I was surprised, you know, because this was Air Force issue to Air Force design for the project, and it's really a pretty crummy camera, but a beautiful artifact at any rate. And so I don't feel quite as bad, because J. Allen botched his big time. And but these things, it's just so incredible, as I've said now so many times. Had it been a metallic disc and it had landed and a couple little critters romped out and roamed around, I would have had 1:37 of video, because I was ready for that. What I saw, I was not ready for. You know, it was so absolutely different. Even though I've been talking to the witnesses in this area who had the ongoing sightings, and they continue yet, trying to describe to me what they were seeing. And in my mind, I thought, I understand what they're seeing, you know, as far as color and size and configuration and so on. And yet, when I saw it myself, I wasn't understanding a bit of it. And mainly because they were trying to describe to me something they had nothing to compare it to. They had never seen anything, as 35 years of research into this stuff, and I've talked to thousands, honestly, of witnesses, and I have never seen anything like this in the sky, on the ground, or anywhere else. And what was especially interesting was the color, because the color was, again, something I have never seen before in real life. Never seen this color. And these people were telling me this, and I'm thinking, oh, come on, you know, you have to have seen this color. But the objects, there were 5 objects. The first 3 were in a horizontal row, and they all had the same basic appearance. The 4th object then became visible, and it was like the first 3, except it was closer, larger. And then the 5th was only 800 or so feet away, and over the field. and I had quite a good view of it. Um, and this thing was, if I was putting an object at that distance, it would be about 20 feet long, about 12, 15 feet wide. So it was a vertical oval, and the central, upper and central area of this was a amber gold color, which I have seen that shade before. But
Stand by, please. I'm sorry. I wonder if you're saying something that somebody doesn't want you to say.
Uh-oh.
I like that better. That's true white balance and truer color tone. Okay.
So the fascinating thing about the object was the outer band of light, which extended from below the top of the object, around the base of it, and up the other side. And this band of light is a color that I've never seen, and the only way I can describe it is a combination of some sort of red, purple, almost what I think of is some of the old paint jobs on cars back when I was a kid, the iridescent purple, or the iridescent, purple. And the fascinating feature was the brightness of the objects. They were almost neon in appearance, a very brilliant neon, and yet they were not bright. It was a very subtle effect. And they were not bright at all, as you would have looking into an auto headlight or a flashlight or anything like that. You were very comfortable looking at them. I mean, they were quite apparent. The problem is with absolutely no sound, and this is in an area where I have heard people talking in a normal tone 1,500 feet away at another cabin down the valley, and these things are just there with no sound. And that's where you start getting this in your stomach as you watch this, because it's so strange. How does something suspend itself in the air with no means of propulsion? And so as I'm looking at these things, they simply close into themselves. And again, the effect that I got, and I really never thought I would use this word in relation to a sighting that I would have, you had a portal effect in my mind. The only thing I could relate to would be if you had something like a giant camera shutter that would open up, revealing the interior, and then after a period of time close back down to that tiny pinhole, and then nothing. And it's a startling effect. It's a startling effect. And these things have been seen in numbers from 1 to 8 objects at a time, in horizontal rows, nearly vertical rows, and moving at very high speeds, hovering, ejecting smaller white spheres that would come out, do a U-ey and come back at tremendous speed, or go out, hover, and then shoot straight up and disappear. And again, we're talking about multiple witnesses in all these events. And these are just good, credible people, and obviously want no publicity whatsoever. So why generate a big, dumb lie and keep it to yourself? You know, it makes no sense. And but we have nearly 40 witnesses. There have been 29 observations since December 15th. And the latest on April 1st was really the most extraordinary in my mind, in that the object was seen by 3 people, a beach ball size white sphere, no sound, no air disturbance, coming up out of the valley, passing between the witnesses and a windmill, putting it at a distance of maybe 30 feet from the witnesses, traveling on down by the spring house, making an abrupt left turn in the tree, just before it comes to the trees, down a little lane in trail then of an automobile full of people that's just leaving. And so obviously the object was zeroing in on the car. The witnesses lost sight of it as it got in trail of the car because of the cabin. They ran up to clear their view of the cabin, and the object was gone. But the fascinating thing is that I have the remote video camera grinding away. The object not only flew right over the camera, but they said it kind of dipped down in front of it, very low to the ground, and made this beautiful left turn right in front of the camera. And the camera's been operable now for, at that time, about 2 weeks, operating perfectly. And after this thing had disappeared, they checked the camera because they were going to just pull the tape right then. And the entire system was not only shut down, the tape had ejected. And we reset everything then the next day, and it's functioned perfectly since. So, being a nuts and bolts sort of person, I have to say, well, it was a coincidence, but come on. That's, so it's just astonishing. This stuff rolls on, and it's certainly changed my approach to the subject. I'm certainly widening my interest now that I've actually seen this display. Meaning, I guess, that I'm now realizing that there are more things going on. Because I've had sort of tunnel vision, I've had to, because with 4,000 trace cases, you're pretty busy with just 4,000 cases. And so I've always tended to gravitate to those cases alone. And now, however, I'm considering a lot of things that I have never considered before. And the funny thing is, years ago, Alan Hynek and I would sit in a dark room somewhere, and he would talk about some of these very things, years ago, that I'm now starting to be interested in. And at that time, I would just shut it out because, all right, I want to stay with the evidence, physical stuff, and not go into speculation or probability or blah, blah. But now it's in the back of my mind, the Hynek discussions is stored, and it's coming to the fore, and I'm thinking, this guy was so far ahead of his time. He was way ahead of all of us.
Okay, what I'm going to be periodically be doing is adjusting the camera shot and such. And the way I'm shooting this, Ted, just so you know, I'm trying not to get an interactive conversation going because I want to be able to have just focus on you when there's a pause or something. If you see me do something like this, then I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
I don't want overlapping conversation for editing purposes.
Okay.
Okay, we're still rolling. The craft that we were just talking about and the colors, certainly because you were able to perceive it, the colors are within the color spectrum of our human eye to see. The question becomes is, if you do you think there would be any discrepancies on celluloid, on film or video, because the particular film or the video is not designed to pick up that color spectrum?
I think absolutely. The witnesses were telling me that the video that they'd shot did no justice whatsoever to the objects. And as I looked at the video video gives you the appearance of a predominant white in the color. There are a couple of images where the orange, amber must have been quite intense because it does actually show up vividly in the video. But generally you get, rather than the orange amber effect or the colors that I saw, the iridescent purple, you get white. And on my video you can see no sign, no trace of this violet effect whatsoever. You can only see the kind of gold amber, orange color. So quite obviously what I want to do is experiment with various types of film to get film sensitive in this part of the spectrum, in this part, and try to make some determinations there. But it's quite obvious that the video camera is not going to give you anything approaching the appearance of these things. And you totally lose the effect on the video. because you're looking at what just look like large, bright, lighted objects. But yet when you see them with your eye, where you can see the greater detail, you know, I can't imagine what effect you would get if you could get a good pair of binoculars on them. I really can't imagine. Except I'm firmly convinced if I ever did that, that there would be no video or photos or anything else taken, because I would refuse to put the binoculars down. You know, I've heard so many people, our first question always is, you know, well, why didn't they take pictures? Why didn't, because we being photographers and looking for evidence and documentation, well, the first thing I'd think about is grabbing the camera. Well, I had the camera in my hand, and I had it turned on, but I'm shooting the ground, because I'm looking at these things in awe. I mean, absolutely in stunned realization that I was seeing something totally incredible. And so I can't imagine an individual who has had no interest in this subject, not familiar with the subject at all, and suddenly they're thrust in the middle of something like this, what their reaction would be, you know. And could we expect them to do anything rational to preserve the data? No, I don't think so. You know, your first inclination is stand there, what the hell is this? What's it going to do next? You know. So I can easily understand why we don't have more photos, more videos. You know.
It might it also be along the same respect with the video or even the photographs, that someone gets an object on tape, takes it back, plays it, and has the distortions or the lack of what it really looked like. And maybe in their mind they're saying, if I take this to somebody, they're going to think I hoaxed it. Do you think there's a percentage of people out there that may have had that experience?
I think that we don't receive a good number of photos and videos for the very reason that I was describing, and that is that it doesn't do justice to what they've seen. And so they're let down, and they're thinking, now if I could show someone what I actually could see with my eye, then they would, without question, believe it. However, I have diminished photographs or video. Doesn't do any justice at all. And so what? I'm not even, I'll not even bring it out. I'm absolutely convinced there are many, many photographs, many videos, and tremendous numbers of cases. I have people at conferences, of course, constantly coming up and saying, leaning over, very quietly, let me tell you what I saw. It was on the ground, and it left a ring, it left this, it left that. And I never told anyone because I didn't want to look like a fool. Who could I have told, And that's one of our problems, the PR problem, because the media and the government has done such a wonderful job of making people feel like loonies if they report things like this. And so they won't report it. They keep it to themselves. And what I see is a tremendous relief when people finally find someone they can tell about this. Down at the second area in the Missouri sightings, at the cabin, a young guy and his lady friend, and they had ongoing sightings and videos and the things on the ground coming up to within 30 feet of them, a couple of physical trace events, and they had not told a living soul. And so the owner of the Site 1 property had gone down there out of curiosity and said, have you guys ever seen anything odd? And he said they started unloading on him without stopping, like they were relieving themselves. They wanted to tell somebody, but they didn't want the publicity. They didn't want people to think they were nuts. And I see that a lot. I see that where people are really vastly relieved at being able to tell someone that will seriously listen. And I just wish there was some way that we could get that out So when a person sees this thing on the ground and it leaves something on the ground, they will immediately know who to call so we can deal with it. You know, I get so much of this stuff where there were landing sites 4 years ago, 10 years ago, 1970, you know. And obviously there's not much you can do after that period of time. So that's just one of the problems that we have. That's the PR thing. And I don't know how we get around that, because if you're seriously involved in UFO research, the media will generally play you in such a light that you look like a fool, and people are then afraid to call you because, well, I'm nuts, I saw this, I'm not going to call this guy because he's nuts, he investigates it. And so we have a very low percentage of the total events, I'm absolutely sure.
Just a little bit. Okay. Along those same regards, is there a central place that people can report a sighting or an incident?
Well, the thing I decided to do last year when I got back into this thing after only a 12-year retirement, I could see that very little had been done with trace cases. And it was quite apparent that what was needed was a central repository for these events. Because it doesn't matter if you have 4,000 or 4 million cases. Numbers really don't matter, but you need the data. You need to look for statistical correlations, patterns, you need the data. And the greater the volume of data, the more significant the patterns are going to be. So I decided, well, if I'm going to have access to this stuff, I'm going to create the Center for Physical Trace Research. And MUFON, CUFOS, FUFAR, all of these groups were very supportive, are very supportive, and they encourage people to get me the data on these cases. And I'm not interested in taking cases away from people. I'm interested in the data. I couldn't care less about traveling all over the planet looking at more landing sites, although some of the good ones you do like to, but to advise anyone that needs advice on how to sample the material and to provide laboratories for analysis of the material. All of these cases, and we have a couple of instances where the traces have really been thoroughly analyzed. The rest of them, I have gone to hundreds of landing sites, and I have gathered from each of those on the order of 20, 30 pounds of material for control and for site analysis. And in all but 2 of those cases, no analysis was even done. And I would send the material to the proper people, and they just sit on it, and there it would lie. And so I have access to a couple of major laboratories who are seriously interested and willing. Now we have to be selective in that I can't just send them tons and tons of soil and plants and bone fragments or alien urine or whatever I happen to collect. So I have to be very selective and not abuse their service. But at least now we do have a repository where people, if they can become aware of it through conferences like this or interviews or whatever, that it's there and they can contact me instantly by email. And then I finally wound up recently generating the website, which serves one purpose, and that is to get the data out to anybody that wants it. Easiest way in the world, except for me, because I have to take the time to format it and get it posted. But eventually all the high strangeness cases will be there, and you'll be able to click on any of those cases, pull up the photos, sketches, any data that I have on this case, analysis, whatever it may be. And in conjunction with that, we have a section called the ongoing cases, which are cases that are still under investigation, such as the Missouri events. And with the remote video cam, anytime we have images of something from this monitoring camera, they will be on the site. And this, as far as I know, is about the first time that's been done other than the Hesselden remote camera. And it is not a constant camera. It just alarms and shoots just a frame or two. Whereas we have the constant monitoring, and we will be increasing that system as time goes on, and its abilities. And I think the really fun thing for me is that when I get a landing case of such high strangeness that I feel it worthy of spending some funds to get there, then people will actually be able to go along by the website, and I will take them with me right into the landing site with digital images and electronic communication. So for the first time, 1 million people, if they like, can tune in and actually go into the landing site with me. And there are a lot of advantages to that, because some of those people will be the scientists that I work with, the chemists, the physicists, the whatevers, and they can email me while I'm standing there at the site and say, well, what is that over here? So it's an opportunity to do something, you know. And for so long, I mean, I have wanted to do this for so many years, something like that, and we just didn't have the ability to do it. And I had an interesting thought from George Winfield yesterday. We were talking about the elk abduction, where the object swoops down and levitates the elk up into the object and carries it off. And as luck would have it, before this happened, I was going through the database looking for levitation cases involving animate or inanimate objects involving traces. And because I had ran onto a case where a cow was supposedly dragged backwards across the field, over a fence, over a gully, up the hill to this object, and there was this hammering, throbbing noise up in the trees. And as luck would have it, in talking to Linda Howe yesterday, she investigated that case. So I will now be getting the entire case, and it's a fascinating thing. But I'm finding numbers of events involving traces where horses have been lifted, automobiles have been lifted, trucks have been lifted, and now, of course, the elk and so on. And it's just really fascinating stuff. And the fascinating thing is, like on the elk case, the object is flying with the wobbling effects, and as though it's a bit unstable. But when it gets hold of the elk, it's really wobbling, like it's having a terrible time accounting for the weight of this animal. And the object appears to 14 witnesses in daylight to enlarge in size to accommodate the elk. And it struggles to get out of this area, actually grazing treetops because it can't get altitude. So this tells you either the little guys are not so smart, or they've totally miscalculated the mass of this elk, or the ability of their machine. That's interesting. That's interesting. They may not be so damn technically advanced after all, you know. But
goes along with what Beverly Trout was saying yesterday. Alien mistakes and confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. You can go in so many directions with this stuff. The levitation business. Well, for example, in the Missouri cases, the four-wheel drive truck with no engine, which they had towed from a junkyard, they towed it into the driveway. The tow bar was still on it. They locked it in gear. They locked the doors. And with no engine, you're not going to take it anywhere anyway. And it's sitting a great big, wide, massive, tall tires. And the people are watching TV, and suddenly the quarter-inch thick glass on their stereo splits vertically right down the middle into two equal pieces for no reason, just does it. And as they're running over to the stereo, they hear this terrific, horrendous noise outside, run around, and this truck with no engine has been pushed forward through the gravel driveway 12 feet, ramming the tow bar through the garage door. And there are deep grooves where obviously the wheels were not turning but digging into the ground. And there were 5 of us who tried to push this truck, and we couldn't move it an inch. We could not move it an inch. Well, it was really 4. I wasn't pushing very hard, but I had to save my strength, but anyway, how does this stuff happen, and why? Why would some unseen force come along and push a motorless truck forward 12 feet? Maybe they were trying to lift it, and they just didn't have the ability, and they wound up having to drag it, and when the tow bar goes through the door of the garage, they have to give it up because whatever they're lifting with is right up against the house. There were no marks on the truck, no indication, no paint changes, no nothing. And I went over and over and over this thing. I thought, well, if you move a truck, there has to be some indication of how it was moved. And it was still locked, and it was locked in gear and 4-wheel drive, and with those big tires, it would have been a real thing to try to roll, even in neutral. And actually, the incline of the driveway, you would have pushed it up slightly uphill. And so if it had rolled on its own, it would have rolled the other direction. But so the elk case is vastly interesting to me, and I'm fascinated by these instances where they have miscalculated, or they have not the ability to lift something that they obviously want to lift.
And thought they could.
Yeah. There was one case where they were trying to lift 3 cows, and they in broad daylight, and they were dumb enough to try to pull them up through a bunch of trees, and they couldn't get them through the trees. They were beating them in the trees, mutilating and killing the cattle in the trees, and finally had to drop them. This is not smart. This is not high-tech stuff. And so what are we really looking at,
Definitely.
Yeah.
2 questions. Years ago, when I saw Stanton T. Friedman speak, this is way back. We're talking early 70s.
Oh, Lord, yes. And I unfortunately remember those days, yeah.
One of the things that he emphasized in his talks then was about, if you see a landed craft, do not approach it, because at that time we didn't know about radiation,
right,
all that sort of thing. Do you ever have any concern when you go to a trace landing site of similar?
I foolishly stumbled into a lot of trace sites without any sort of protection. Didn't even use surgical gloves or anything for taking samples. And eventually, of course, pretty quickly, I started using the gloves, but to prevent contamination of the material if I had to handle it with my hands. But I had no concern because we have very few events involving any kind of detectable radiation. And what analysis we've done, there again is no indication of radiation in any great quantity. And so I was not really concerned. Now, in the Delphos case, for example, had I not been quite so young, I would have been thinking, if the witnesses touched the soil and their hands were numb, then perhaps I should do something a little different with this. But I suffered no effects from this whatsoever, but I know of 7 people, including a scientist whose name would be recognized by just about anyone in the field, who experienced the numbing effect. And this guy, it was in July, and it was very hot, and he not only experienced the numbing of the hand, it frightened him a great deal. And he ran, I remember this so well, toward the farmhouse so he could wash up quickly. And as he was running, he was really sweating, and it was running in his eyes, and he forgot, and he swiped his hand, and his face went numb, and he really went ballistic. And I can see him very well at the sink with soap and water flying everywhere. It was a very real effect. And some of the analysis is indicating some of the components in that soil could have been responsible for the numbing. So generally, I would say in the vast majority of the sites, it's perfectly safe to go in there. You're certainly not likely to encounter radiation, and there really don't seem to be other effects. Uh, the the one thing that I would say, the single type of site that a person should be very careful in approaching are the sites that have a luminous glow. And because there is a reaction going on there that we don't understand, we think it is a chemiluminescence effect. It's not heat, and of course not bioluminescence. Uh, Perhaps we're not sure of that, but we are convinced that there is very little thermoluminescence effect, very little heating involved or anything, any kind of heat reaction. But I'm still open on the bioluminescence and especially chemiluminescence effects. But that's the only type of material I would be concerned handling if it was still active, and by that I mean glowing.
Okay. Give us an overview in some significant detail. We've got time for this. What does a thorough soil analysis comprise of?
Well, I can speak as far as what needs to be done with the material. Of course, I'm not a chemist, so this, and I always stress this, that I am but a lowly engineer, civil engineer, generally called uncivil engineer, but so that the analysis end of it, I know very little about. When Alan Hynek suggested I get into this specialty area, he arranged for me to get a little bit of education from various specialists. They could tell me what kind of samples they would need, how they should be taken, how they should be documented. So we were getting them the material in the proper way. And so beyond the interrogation or the interviewing of the witnesses, I hate that word interrogation. Phil Klass does interrogation. Beyond interviewing the witnesses and documenting the site in every way, which can mean laying down a grid over the site so you know exactly where you're taking samples and so on, and the overlay of the site. As far as the actual analysis, that's totally out of my realm. But I can tell you this: we started the last phase of the Delphos analysis, 2 very large major labs. And we started this in December, and it will be the end of April before it's completed. And I have a list of the tests that they've done, and they have taken this stuff apart. And infrared scanning, thermoluminescence, gas spectrometry, all kinds of tests that I couldn't even pronounce and are meaningless to me. Now, the analytical chemists understand, of course, what they're doing. And the head of the project at this one major lab in this country has 35 years of experience as an analytical chemist and is ranked one of the top 10 in the United States. So this is a very qualified person. And the interesting thing is that when the samples arrived, they were immediately getting such astonishing results, the difference between the control and the site, that people from other departments started coming in and they said, hey, let me run this. And so the entire lab got involved in a big way because they were seeing something they'd not seen before. So I don't know what the results are going to be. They probably will be inconclusive. In other words, they'll not be able as a laboratory to say this is extraterrestrial. I'm sure they won't. But I can tell you this, there are some vast differences in this material. And what will really be great is, I swear, the Delphos report after only 27 years will be completed and released in July of this year. And it's going to be a voluminous thing, and it'll be, I hope, quite interesting, because this case has been looked at in many ways, including analysis, to such a degree, well, to a degree that we've never looked at any case before. And what I'm trying to do with that single case is develop a baseline report that we can use for future cases. This will be the classic baseline case of what is seen, how it's dealt with, how the samples should be taken, and how they should be looked at, because it has all been done.
This will be textbook.
It will be. It absolutely will be a textbook case. And so I'm looking forward to getting that out to anyone that wants it. And I'm not sure how it will be published. The UFO Coalition gave me some funding to finish the report, which means printer ink and phone calls and everything else to get it wound up. And so I'm going to turn it over to them, and they can do with it as they wish. And I've had many suggestions that you need to write a book just on Delphos, and you could do it. You honestly could. I have right now hundreds and hundreds of pages of analysis alone, much less all the interviews and the meat of the observation. And it is an extraordinary case. And I was so disturbed when the Sturrock report came out last year. And I was not disturbed because I was very happy that it came out. And I like Peter Sturrock, and I've known him since the 70s. But the only bone of contention was that in a section of it they termed the 10 best physical trace cases. And this was done primarily by Jacques Vallée, who I've known for 30 years. And not one of those cases would I list in the top 500. Not one. They're lousy cases. And being on good terms with both of those guys, I emailed them and I basically told them that. You know, I said, you're telling the world these are the 10 best cases we've got. And they're far from it, far. Not one, not one. And Jacques' response was that, well, he didn't really mean to represent them as the top 10 ever. And Sturrock's response was, I didn't realize. He said, yes, we were making a mistake putting it that way, and that in future news conferences and so on, press releases, they would stress the fact that they were not saying these were the top 10 cases. And Sturrock has asked me to do a report for the Journal of Scientific Exploration on Delphos. So it'll also be coming out in a very condensed form in the journal, which is a terrific step forward, just to get them to look to publish a UFO case.
Okay. You mentioned something here very, very, not only interesting, but classical. Jacques Vallée makes a statement to whatever media, as does Mr. Sturrock.
Mm-hmm.
And as you point out, it's not quite accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And yet these guys are going to have to live with this for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happened to Dr. Hynek.
Yes.
Can you, for our viewers, give us briefly what happened there, and why do you think that happens?
You're talking about the swamp gas?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Alan Hynek and I had 2 years before I met him. I see this interview on TV, and here's J. Allen Hynek. And I had been looking for a couple of years prior to that into cases on my own, out of curiosity, writing up the reports and doing the best I could. And suddenly I see the preeminent figure on TV, national TV, saying, well, some of these cases could be swamp gas. Well, anyone knowing the media knows that that's going to go from some of these could be to scientist says UFOs are swamp gas. And it did. And so I was so angry that I whip up a 3-page letter with the paper burning and send it to Northwestern University, attention Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And surprisingly, in about a week, I get a 4-page letter back. And what a wonderful guy. I can never say enough about J. Allen Hynek. He was a wonderful human being. and always was, always will be, dead or alive, a wonderful person. And he took the time to sit down and write me a 4-page letter trying to explain why he did this. And I was so amazed that I got the letter, a response, that he would take the time, that I was impressed. And so I cut him a little slack. I was still angry about it. This has put ufology back 100 years, And so then when we finally got together in 1968, and from that time on until he passed away, we had many, many conversations, private conversations, driving across the country, flying across, doing whatever. And how many times he brought up the Ann Arbor, Michigan thing, because it troubled him until his last breath expired. And what happened there was that he was sent up by the Air Force to calm the people down. He arrived in Ann Arbor, had not even had a chance to go out to the area, talk to the people or anything, and he gets a call that there will be a press conference, have an answer. So at that point when the cameras start rolling, he had a choice. And this, I can tell you without qualification, is the truth, the reason. He could close the door on the Air Force and any information he would ever get from them again by saying, well, I don't know what is happening here. I haven't even had a chance to talk to these people. Or he could keep his foot in the door for future information and data because they were collecting this stuff. Even though it was kind of a sham project, they were still getting a lot of information. And he could keep his foot in the door and give some kind of off-the-wall explanation. There was a swamp in the area, so it wasn't Looney Tunes. And although you have to kind of ignore the observation to even consider it, but he said some of the cases may be. And by doing that, he had to suffer with that the rest of his life, and suffer he did. It bothered him a great deal, because this was a man that wanted the truth, and he wanted to get the truth out there, and he wanted to talk about the truth. And because of his position in science, he couldn't always stand up there and answer questions in the way that he would have liked to. And so unfortunately, the few of us who had really nice, long, private conversations got to really know the guy. And so that's what happened there. I mean, it was a choice of retaining some information or losing it all. And I think he made the right choice. It was unfortunate that he had to go through that media thing of misquoting and embellishing the his whole response.
And that was military directed. He didn't have an option in that.
No, he didn't. No. He had no option.
Wow.
So, but all I can never say enough what a wonderful human being this guy was. The first time I met him, he flew in Columbia, Missouri on a DC-3, and I was absolutely scared to death. I was a kid yet, and this was the man, And instantly, he was like your dad. I was so at ease. I mean, this guy. One of the wonderful things working that closely with him, being able to go out to case after case with him and watch him handle the witnesses, was an inspiration to me. And it has allowed me to get a lot of information from farmers and whoever that you might not get, because first thing, he became their friend. And he was a sincere friend. He was not in there just ripping them off for information. And but just to watch him go about, his big thing was to have them relive. And he always had this stopwatch, always had this watch. And he would start them out, okay, this is happening now, and have them relive it. And the more I watched this work, extracting, and the guy will suddenly say, I forgot this part. It did this. And his demeanor with people then allowed me to kind of follow along and have the same sort of approach. And it has worked. Most people, thankfully, are very comfortable talking with me. And because you don't go in there with a rubber hose and say, look, I'm doing you a favor, give me all your information. You don't do it that way. And so what can I say? When he got to know when he trusted someone, when they became his friend, he was like a father, a brother, all these figures that you ever wanted to be around. Just a wonderful guy, And no one will ever replace him in the field. That's the unfortunate thing. There is no one out there that will be another J. Allen Hynek. And ufology has gone very much downhill as far as organization and rallying around the flag without J. Allen, because he was always that focal point, and he had some influence, and he was a scientist. And he talked in very clear, uncertain terms as much as he could without making himself look like a Looney Tune. And so people believed him when he said something, and they should, But we don't have that anymore. We have people who, unfortunately, tend to vacillate a bit back and forth, which change is fine. I'm going through changes now myself. I'm realizing I'm having interest in things that I pushed aside for years. But change is great. But this thing of having this the predominant theory today, this the predominant theory tomorrow, there has to be some sort of continuity in what we're saying and what we're talking about. And so it's too bad, But I can't see anyone on the horizon that could fill the shoes,
Well, okay, another question here. I'm glad we're able to do this. I mean, you and I have never really had a real chance to talk and discuss. Speaking of clarifying, let's clarify, because I've heard rumors over the years. Just prior to Dr. Hynek's death, rumor has it that he found a banker. He was going to open $1 million facility in Arizona or someplace, and then just prior to all that coming together, he dies. Is there any ominous factor involved here, or was it even true that he had found backing? What's the story there?
Well, as I understand it, and I talked to Alan just very few days before he passed away, and I was so encouraged because he was doing quite well, and I had spent an entire day with him 3 weeks before they found the problems, and he knew that he had some problems, and he said, "Can we just go out?" We had a little cottage away from the house. He said, "Can we just go out and just spend a day talking?" And I said, "Sure." And I could tell that he was very concerned that something was going on physically with him. And so we talked. We went over a lot of things. And I learned just recently, he did not talk to me about this, so I can't really comment from a personal perspective. But I learned later from folks who should know that indeed he had been approached by a group in Scottsdale, in that area, about funding, and evidently turned over some of the really good stuff, maybe all of his files, to them. And because I've tried to retrieve some of that since his death and Mimi's death, and it's not there. It doesn't exist, as best I can determine. And so the word that I have is that this material was donated, given to something, to this group, and they will not allow access to it. Beyond that, I don't know. But there are a couple of cases I've tried to get more information, retrieve information on. For example, he and I investigated a terrific landing case together in Medford, Minnesota, 1975. There was like 25 witnesses, nice trace, some anomalies in the analysis and so on. And so I was at the center last September, and I couldn't find any reference to the Medford case at all. And after I got home, I emailed Mark Rodiger, and he checked, and he said, Ted, there's nothing. We have absolutely nothing. And I said, well, hell, I know it happened because he and I were both there. And my reason for wanting the information was that we were so pushed for time, he talked to the witnesses, and I worked the trace. So I really knew very little about the actual case, just the traces. So I wanted to get this in because it's such a good case. And I cannot find a reference to the Medford Minnesota. It's like it never happened, except I've got photos of he and I there, and there is nothing in the CUFOS files. So I don't know if it was given to this funding group before he passed away, or what has happened to the case. But I do know there are a number of cases gone without a trace. Is that interesting for a trace researcher? They're gone. And some of them were trace cases, and it's I don't know where they're at. But someone does, because someone has the data. They have the files.
Does this group still exist?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I really don't know. I just asked Mark, I remember at one point, would it do any good if I'd go knock on their door? And he said, no, I've tried that. So, I don't know. But for some reason, they're just sitting on anything that they have. And, I can't say what they have because I have no idea. Except apparently he did turn over some or a lot, or I don't know, of his files.
Well, you knew the man. Why would he choose to do that?
Funding. We always, believe me, 20 years we worked together. And for 20 years we tried everything to get funding. And in 20 years we had one $4,000 grant. And then you have the skeptics sitting out there saying, where's the evidence? Yeah. Take $4,000, spread it over 20 years. Where's the evidence? And believe me, we used that like we were in the middle of the Great Depression. And very selective on what cases we would use it to look at and so on. And with those kind of figures, you couldn't pay for analysis. All you could do would be to buy some gasoline to drive to the site, or maybe a plane ticket if it was a really great case, and hope that you'd have the money to get a ticket back. Right. And so that was, it was always the funding, and he tried everything because he knew what to do if he just could have had the money to do it. But it was never there. And there was always the carrot. And there would be some individual or some group. And he was so desperate to try to get the data, to access it and to utilize it and to study it, that he would follow the carrot just about anywhere, And I was the same way. If there was any chance, I'd waste a lot of time talking to someone in hopes that maybe we would extract a few dollars to get to another site. And
experienced that yesterday. In speaking to the aspect of funding, when I talked with Colonel Stevens, he explained to me the whole thing with the Billy Meyer case, the money he and his associates put into it, and then, I guess, fortunately enough, the Japanese were interested in the story and agreed to pay them the money that was spent. But he made a very interesting comment that this business, as far as money, it's like anything else. The investor wants to see where's the payoff. What would you submit to someone that would have substantial funds, like Lawrence Rockefeller? What is going to be their payoff? It may not be putting a movie in theaters and making $300 million. What is either the philanthropic payoff or actual cash payoff?
Yeah, that that has always been the problem because the the funding source, obviously you can't just toss money around, and they have to make choices. Is this worthwhile? And so the funding source has to be able to see some possibility of a return or a benefit of some kind. And so I have a little less of a problem than most of the people in the field because I'm talking about physical things that can be dealt with, and they remain after the object is long gone. So we're not dealing with just visual observations and the accounts of people. And so I have a little easier job selling, but the problem is no buyers. This has always been the problem. So much good data has gone through my fingers because I couldn't do anything with it. And in some cases, I couldn't get to the site to gather the proper samples. And we just had a case in December in Italy, a very intriguing case. And I understand from researchers over there that the individual that arrived there first really bungled the site, went in before he took photos or anything else, digging and destroying the site. And there was a reddish glassy material found, and he turned it over to a religious cult group for analysis. Come on. Come on, you know. It's hard enough to get results from a major lab, but a religious cult group? And so, you know, you have to sit there and watch this stuff go through your fingers, you know. There are a lot of trace cases, but the really good ones are not that plentiful. So you have to strike when you got something to strike at. And but as far as if I was going for funding, what I could approach him with is the possibility of retrieving some artifact that would go towards, or perhaps the combination of several cases would build up a database that would be a tremendous indicator physically of and scientifically of the existence of something out of the ordinary. Now, I've arrived at a point where I find it difficult to imagine being able to convince a Phil Klass or Jim Oberg, and you can say, well, who really cares if I can convince those people or not, because their minds are made up. And you could drag a screaming alien in, and those guys would refuse to believe it. They'd say it was a monkey or who knows what. But so you don't worry too much about them, but you do worry about the scientific community. You know, you've got to have something substantial that they can look at to get them to look at it. You've got to be able to drag something, a corpse or an object, an artifact, beyond question that they will look at. You know, and so the only thing I can really offer is trying to do that. And I think there have been some cases over the years that might have brought us to the brink of real discovery. I think the Delphos case, if I would have had funding in 1971 to do everything that needed to be done, we didn't have the technology then to do analysis that we're doing now, and it probably would have required current analysis to back up what you were finding back then, the new technologies. But I think that that case would have gone an extreme distance in turning around some of the scientific community. And I do know that back in the mid-'70s, when we were working with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics UFO Subcommittee, Peter Sturrock and his group, that those people were very interested, and God love him, Peter Sturrock is very open to this subject. He's no blithering Looney Tune that believes everything that comes along, but he is also an open-minded scientist, and he gives you the benefit of the doubt. He listens and he looks. And back at that time, he arranged for Hynek and Valet and I and Dave Saunders to make a presentation to the 13th Aerospace Sciences Convention in California. All of the top aerospace engineers in the country. And Peter was so nervous the morning of this event that no one would show up because they would be embarrassed to come to a UFO symposium. And the auditorium was huge. It was so full. They were sitting on the stage, steps of the stage, and standing outside. Couldn't even get in the auditorium. And they took it very seriously. We had very good questions. And then we were asked to go out to the Jet Propulsion Lab and do basically the same thing. And I had a lot of those people come up to me afterwards. And the thing they were impressed with were the physical landing sites. This is something that these guys, as engineers and so on, could get their hands into. And it's their best bet, you know. It will take physical evidence to resolve this, barring the little guys or whatever, whoever they are, deciding to land and have lunch with Bill and Hillary.
Do they have to do that?
But who would believe Bill if he said they had landed? So, you know. We got into that same thing with Jimmy Carter. We were all kind of excited. Well, Carter admitted that he may have had a UFO sighting. I think perhaps there's a chance it was Venus, but nevertheless, at least he was willing to talk about it. And so we were kind of encouraged because he said, if I become president, I will see that this is released to the public, the UFO information. And, of course, he didn't do that. And we were all, you know, running around thinking, boy, maybe, finally. And then he has the encounter in the rowboat with the killer rabbit and beats this rabbit to death who's trying to attack him in the rowboat. And there went his credibility. So I remember very well in lectures saying, you know, well, but who would believe him now? So
what are you going to do?
I don't know. Just keep trying.
That's right. You have had an experience that most Americans wouldn't even have a clue about. In fact, probably most people all over the world wouldn't have a clue about. And what I'm referring to is you're addressing the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about? And do you think they listened?
Well, the UN meeting was quite extraordinary. And, of course, one of the highlights of my life, just going into the interior of the building is quite an experience. And the way it came about was I went home for lunch one Thursday afternoon, and my wife says, you just had a call from Wellington Friday. And I said, okay. And she said, you're supposed to be at the UN tomorrow. And I said, okay, who's Wellington Friday? Well, he was the ambassador to the UN from the country of Grenada. And he had called inviting me to join the group there. The group being J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée and Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, and Len Stringfield. And we had been personally invited by the president of Grenada, Sir Eric Gary, and for a meeting with Kurt Waldheim, the Secretary General, and then to speak to the assemblage. And so quite rapidly I prepared to go to New York City, and I had to go to a sprint car race the morning of the day that I'm flying to New York, so I can remember that was quite a day. And I went directly from the race to the airport, and we had our private suites all adjoining, and spent a lot of time talking to Sir Eric Gary, who had had a sighting. Very interested in that. Unfortunately, he was also pretty heavily into voodoo and some of the other stuff, and Alan was a little disturbed. I have a photo of Alan sitting on a sofa in Sir Eric's room, and Sir Eric would go on and on about some of these things, and Alan's sitting over there kind of about to doze off, and on the other side is Miss World of 1970, who was Sir Eric's secretary. And but it's an interesting picture, just the expression on Alan's face. So we were becoming a little discouraged by, Sir Eric, simply because he sounded a little over the edge We were appreciating the fact that he had arranged this, of course. And the meeting with Waldheim was interesting because of the security there. Here we come in, suits, ties, and untypical for some of us in the group. But anyway, and we have to go through 2 outer offices. They have a photographer that's shooting pictures of you every second you're around there. And the Secretary General was very interested, very bright guy, very friendly, cordial. And I remember one of the people very interested in a particular case was a Russian ambassador. And the case he was interested in was the event over Iran in '76 where the 2 F-4s had their armament system and communication locked up by an object. And that was the case he was interested in. Obviously, how do you shut down a couple of F-4s from a half mile or so away? So I understood his interest there, But we were really hoping to initiate interest in a global investigation with a central repository for events. And you cannot bring together over 100 nations on anything. And that's where it went. It died on the vine. But it was a gratifying and very interesting experience to have gone there and done that and talked to some of these people. I mean, it was wonderful. And of course for us as our little group to be able to relax and sit in I sat in a Mexican restaurant with by Gordon Cooper. And Gordon is a very quiet, reserved, doesn't say much sort of guy. And in the many hours that we spent that night in this restaurant, he opened up and was the fun guy of the whole thing. And just being able to sit there and talk to him about some of the old Mercury, Gemini things that went on. And some of the things the guys did, it was just great. It was a wonderful, wonderful evening. And I remember he and Alan and I riding across New York in a cab together. And he and Alan talking about various things. And I'm sitting there thinking, as still yet a punk kid, basically, should I really be hearing some of this? And it was pretty amazing. Between some of the things I was hearing and discussions, very interesting discussions, and the taxi cab driver trying to kill us going across New York, it was quite an experience. But I have been very fortunate to have been in the right places at the right time. And of course, Alan he trusted me and he believed in what I was trying to do and was a constant promoter. And so it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. And when he died, it just wasn't fun anymore. And so I got out of it, Without Alan to talk to on the phone or to go somewhere with, it really didn't mean much. And but I had made him a promise that I would finish the Delphos case. And my wife constantly reminded me of this promise. She said, at 56, don't you think you should be getting on with this promise? And which is the last thing a 56-year-old guy needs to hear. But so I decided, okay, I'll get back in and I will contact the witnesses and I'll try to finish, because no definitive report was ever written on it. And so when I got to that point, then I started talking with the old guys, And Stanton Friedman, God love him, has been after me for the last 12 years to get back in. And he says, Ted, nobody's talking about physical evidence. Get in here, And so I did. And I'm glad I did, because it has been rewarding and quite a pleasure. And I'm constantly amazed at how many people even remember who I am, because it's been so many years. And what I was doing was not all that great compared to Hynek and Vallée. I was not writing books. I was not a famous author and so on. And but fortunately, I guess some of the work that I did was of interest enough that people recalled that it had been done. And so it's fun, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And I have projects beyond my wildest dreams ongoing right now, and I hope we're going to get some results. I'm going to do my dead level best. Maybe at 57, I shouldn't use dead level. But it's like one of the entertainers in Branson always says, if you wake up on the right side of the grass.
So you actually, for a period of 12 years, retired from the field
Yes.
because of Dr. Heinig's death.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. It just there was just no reason. There was no because we would call each other when he was. I remember when he was doing the Spielberg film, Close Encounters. He would go out and he was like a kid. He was so excited when they were doing the little guy shots coming out of the object and so on. And in that sequence, Alan had the part where he walks up. Well, he had a much larger part than that. Spielberg had him falling down on his knees. I mean, he was getting into Shakespeare stuff. Jay Allen, and he was so excited. Boy, here I am, and he and Spielberg became very good friends. And he would, I remember one evening he called me from, I believe it was Georgia, where they had filmed the humanoid sequence, little kids in the outfits. And he was so excited, and when the Pascagoula thing happened with Hickson and Parker taken into this thing, he and Jim Harder went down there to investigate it. And every evening he would call and update me on, we'd talk about it. And it was just that way always, we were just in touch. And if we weren't out together on something, we were together by whatever means, by phone or whatever, And
so you essentially lost your trail riding buddy.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was like having the brother I never had. It was like having a second father. And I guess what would cover it overall, a fellow traveler. And that's in the dedication on the Delphos report, which, by the way, will be called the Delphos Effect, thanks to Biker Bob. And he came up with that, and I thought, that's great. That's a good title. And but it will be the report and the work dedicated to Jay Allen, who was a dear friend and a fellow traveler. And we went to lands that very few people have seen. And that's about as poetic as I can get. But he was a wonderful guy, wonderful person.
Is there anything that you would like to add? Anything? Well, let me give it a little bit of structure here. Since we're coming into the new millennium and such, do you have from the various talks you've done with various researchers, whether we're talking contactees, abductees, a bazillion sightings in Mexico that make it on the news there and nothing makes it on the news here?
True.
Just with everything going on, do you have any sense of what the new millennium might bring for us in regards to ufology?
I think I'm not much of a believer in the year 2000 amounting to much. It's just another year. The sun will come up. It'll go down. We may have some computer problems, and I've talked to a number of people about that, and there are some seriously concerned folks about the computer problems and what they could generate. And I agree with that, and I think it would be foolhardy to simply say, it's going to be fine. I think we have to make some preparations. But as far as UFOs, what it is doing, it is regenerating interest, because a lot of folks look at the millennium, at the year 2000, as a significant benchmark. And so the interest now is really ascending on UFOs, parapsychology, you name it, anything a little bit out of the ordinary. And I think with the New Age approach, which has some good sides to it, in that people are willing to look, to consider things that they might have rejected just a few years ago. we're, I think, a great deal more enlightened, and especially after Al Gore invented the internet and allowed us to have all of this wonderful communication and knowledge at our fingertips. I can sit there and do, in 2 hours, the research that would have taken me weeks. It's amazing. And I can talk to Russian scientists and say, do you have a photo of so-and-so, and have that photo in a minute. You know, I mean, it's great. And forget the good old days. I was there, and they were good. They had their good points, and it was enjoyable. But these are the good old days, because suddenly we had the ability to do what we were wanting to do in the 60s and 70s and couldn't. We have the capability there. And but what I see in ufology is not only the rejuvenated interest, but the pattern seems to be changing based on 90, I guess about 99 years of trace cases. Because basically what I do, the database goes back beyond 1900, but what I generally look at statistically is 1900 and up. Because there's so many variables of what might have been happening in 1700. You know, the guy might have seen a meteor. It could have been any number of things. And there's no way to objectively put that in the data as an event. But at any rate, from 1900 until the current time, we were seeing pretty high numbers on physical trace landings per year. And in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we were seeing something like 200, 300, 400 cases a year of physical trace landings, which is a significant number, especially if there's only one guy really looking at them.
That's almost one a day.
Yeah, exactly. But in 1998, we had 21 cases. 2 of the 21 cases were good, extraordinarily good, interesting cases, and they were both the sites were totally destroyed by sightseers and incompetent people trying to investigate it. The only 2 good cases of the year. So at any rate, we then dropped down to 21 reports. And another thing that has happened without question is they have fled the United States as far as trace landing events. The vast majority of the 21 cases occurred in foreign countries. And so there's some changes there. But the other change that I'm seeing is there seems to be, while you have the decrease in physical landings, you seem to be getting into more reports of smaller spherical objects, orbs, some at very close range, doing some pretty weird things, electromagnetic effects, like shutting your camera down at just the wrong time, and which again I think probably was coincidence, but anyway, so this seems to be something to look for. I think we're coming for some reason. And there's no way to second guess it, because I don't know who the guys are that are producing the little spheres. You know, I have no idea. Or what their reason, their purpose for being is. But based on what I'm seeing, based on the data, the facts, we are going from the very large objects into a land, and the landing situations, into these small spheres, such as we're seeing in a couple of locations in Missouri, and I understand now in other areas, where there is an ongoing display for some reason. And there has to be a reason. You know, they're not just there for the fun of it. So what I'm trying to do is, and occasionally in those we get traces, but by and large they are aerial objects. Well, if there are no physical traces involved to any great extent, the next best thing I can do is try to get physical evidence through photography and through measurements with instruments. Try to get the physical evidence that way, and that's where I'm going with these projects, to constant monitor the areas, try to discern any patterns, and develop some knowledge of what's happening there. But I really do think And as soon as I say this, this will be the biggest year in trace landings in America ever. But at this point, it seems to be moving in another direction, and it's interesting. It's an interesting direction. I think, for one thing, what I have seen, not in my sighting, but in the other events that's going on, is an element of definite intelligence, because the objects are reacting to physical things around them, such as getting in trail of a making a very tight, abrupt turn to get in trail of an automobile, and to do certain things. So it's going to be interesting. I may not be digging up a lot of dirt, but that's okay. I've had 35 years of that. I'm ready to let the dirt digging go a little bit, and go another direction for a while. But I can tell you this: things so far this year are so interesting, and going quite well as far as research, that I know somewhere, probably right here in this room at some point, J. Allen Hynek is doing a spin, and if there's any way he can help, I can assure you he'll help. He's there.